That was Son of the Sun by the Micmac songwriter and activist Willie Dunn. Welcome, everybody. My name is Becca Konomopoulos. I'm the co-founder and director of the Natural History Museum. We're not a traditional museum. We call ourselves a museum for the movement, founded by artists and activists and scholars. Our mission is to advance social, climate, and environmental justice. So we are thrilled to be hosting Indigenizing Coastal Conservation, and the enthusiasm around this has been really inspiring. More than 725 people registered. So welcome and thanks for joining us on a Friday afternoon or evening, wherever you are. This event is part of a larger ongoing event series called Natural History for a World in Crisis. And the series is organized by the 2023 to 2025, our inaugural cohort of Red Natural History Fellows with the Natural History Museum. So I want to thank the sponsors of the series, the Henry Luce Foundation, the Hewlett Foundation, as well as For Culture from King County. First, before we start, I just want to invite everybody to please introduce yourselves in the chat. We'd love to know your name and affiliation, where you're calling in from, and also what you're hoping to get out of this event. We also just want to thank all of our panelists and Dina Gilio-Whitaker, one of the Red Natural History Fellows, who is an organizer of today's event. I'm going to go ahead and, one last thing in terms of ground rules. So we encourage you to participate in the chat. There is a Q&A function at the bottom. You'll notice on your Zoom screen that you can add a question there. If you have a question for any of our panelists, we'll be monitoring both the chat and the Q&A. And also, don't worry, we are recording this event and the chat as well, and we'll be sending both of those out afterwards. So with that, I'm going to toss it over to our research director at the Natural History Museum, Steve Lyons, who will tell you a little bit more about this series and today's discussion.
All right, thank you, Becca, and thank you everyone for coming to this event. So this event is within a series that we've called Natural History for a World in Crisis. So this series looks broadly at the capitalist and colonial processes that have transformed the world, as well as the practices, worldviews, and traditions of resistance that have stood against these processes, contributing in their own way to the shape of the crises we face. So over the course of the year, we'll think about how extractive and imperialist systems make natural history from above, insofar as this long history of imperialist domination and rampant extraction have left indelible marks on the very ecosystems that we inhabit. But this series isn't just about critique. It's not just about the violent histories that brought us to the crises we face today. It's also, more importantly, about the creative and rooted ways in which people make natural history from below. So the non-dominating and non-exploitative land-based practices that are capable of sustaining life, practices that themselves have histories which we can and should learn from and expand in our efforts to protect the world we inhabit for generations to come. So today's event looks at what it means to place Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous sovereignty at the heart of conservation, unpacking the stakes for a struggle within the conservation arena that will have lasting consequences, not just for conservation, but for the world that conservation organizations are tasked to protect. So thank you everyone for coming, and for Dina, Leah, Gus, and Kala for bringing your experience to bear on this call. So Dina Gilio-Whitaker will start us off with an introduction, and after a first round from Leah Mata-Fragua, Gus Gates, and Kala Allison, Dina will lead us in an open roundtable on this topic. So again, as Becca mentioned, if you have questions for the panelists, please send them via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. So without further.
Okay. Okay. Well, let's just dive right in. Why hascalao isquis Dina Gilio-Whitaker u the e sinkailu squeeze seal wait. I'm a descendant of the Colville Confederated Tribes, Sinaiaks and Okanagan bands, and a lecturer of American Indian Studies at Cal State University, San Marcos, which is in San Diego County. Thank you for choosing to spend your Friday evening with us as we explore what indigenizing ocean conservation means and what it looks like. As we set the stage for this discussion, the starting place is to acknowledge that the history of conservation more broadly is rooted in the dispossession of indigenous lands and resources. As I laid out in my last book, As Long as Grass Grows, the Indigenous Fight for Environmental Justice from Colonization to Standing Rock. In the book, I made the case that for American Indian people, this history of dispossession constitutes environmental injustice, and that today's conservation of the natural world must factor in environmental justice principles that are responsive to tribes with the aim of restoring land and jurisdiction to tribes. My work as a scholar is always place-based and community engaged. As someone who lives in coastal Southern California, not only am I a scholar and an educator, I'm also a surfer, and I engage with the ocean in a really deeply personal way, while at the same time I am aware of myself as a guest in the homelands of the Ohashiman Nation Juaneño Band of Mission Indians. Since the book came out, I have been working in the ocean conservation space in a variety of ways, which includes advising different kinds of groups on how to effectively engage with tribal communities for different purposes, all focused through this EJ lens and what I call unerasing Native people, because nowhere is the erasure of Indigenous people more profound than in coastal Southern California. Each of the panelists here today are folks I have worked with or am currently working with in this way. They are people dedicated to reversing old patterns of injustice and imagining futures that center Indigenous agency and knowledge for the good of all. California provides an ideal foundation for talking about what it means to indigenize and decolonize ocean conservation precisely because of the state's brutal history of domination and land theft. The landscape and littoral zones of California have been dramatically transformed, not for the better, since the arrival of Europeans and Americans. And while Indigenous people were forcefully removed to make room for the new arrivants and remain disempowered in many ways, they are still present in their coastal homelands, engaging in customary practices of subsistence gathering of food and cultural materials, and maintaining their relationships to the land and sea. With the ramping up of environmental problems throughout the 20th century, which includes the depletion of marine-based life and the warming of the ocean, among many other things, the state responded in 1999 by passing the Marine Life Protection Act. It took another decade for the MLPA to be implemented, which took the form of a network of marine protected areas along the 1,100-mile coastline. These MPAs enacted various levels of restrictions that govern what can and can't be harvested and how much. Some MPAs restrictions are more strict than others. While the MLPA was well intended, it failed at the outset to consider the perspectives of California Indians. Subsistence activities as they had been practiced since long before the creation of the state of California were ignored. These practices were thus effectively criminalized as a result, and customary stewardship based on Indigenous knowledge, ecosystem knowledge, was shunned in favor of Western scientific methods. This left tribes scrambling to have their voices heard, and for the last decade or so, it has been a matter of damage control to rectify the problems. Over the last few years, there has been an observable uptick in interest among conservationists, environmentalists, activists, and researchers who increasingly see the value in working with tribal communities. I see it as a direct result of the ongoing efforts of tribal communities to protect their natural resources in struggles like the Dakota Access Pipeline, the Keystone XL Pipeline, Line 3, now with lithium issues like the Thacker Pass lithium mine, also the protection of sacred sites, and countless other kinds of battles. It's also tied directly to climate change, which impacts everyone. Until recently, our political system has shown itself to lack the political will to address this existential crisis, meaning climate change, in any serious way, bringing us closer and closer to a tipping point from which there may be no return. A growing sense of urgency has mobilized action in the Biden administration, and we've seen some interesting policy shifts, such as a 2022 implementation memorandum issued by the White House for federal agencies on recognizing and including Indigenous knowledge in federal research, policy, and decision making. And that's a quote that's taken directly from that policy statement issued by the White House. Then there was the Inflation Reduction Act, which has been called a climate bill, which allocated $391 billion to climate and energy projects. Surfrider Foundation recently identified $6 billion earmarked for ocean conservation. At the state level, California has allocated $50 billion for climate action over the past 3 years, with $100 million for the University of California system alone. These are unprecedented new levels of funding for climate initiatives, which often incentivize tribal engagement in research and other community-based climate and environmental restoration projects. The impacts of the history of the deliberate erasure of Indigenous knowledge is far from resolved. And we also know enough about the history of cultural appropriation in the environmental movement to be aware of how Native knowledge can be and has been misused. I also write about that in the book. In other words, we can acknowledge and celebrate this institutional shift in perspective that values Native knowledges while being cautious about the potential landmines. With the incentivizing of tribal engagement, tribal communities face new challenges, not the least of which involves limited capacity to meet requests for inclusion in research projects and the sharing of knowledge in community-based activism. This is the new context for ocean conservation in the US, Hawaii, and North America more broadly. Canada is a notable site for progress for the integration of Indigenous knowledge in marine system management. But focusing on California is particularly useful for identifying ongoing challenges and lessons learned. And we'll hear about that more from Kala. Each of today's webinar participants are deeply engaged in the work of Indigenous coastal conservation, and we turn to them now for their valuable insights. So what we'll do is start with Leah. Leah, please take it away.
Titʻu misaksaki michu mi Mata-Fragua, and I'm from the most northern band of Chumash speaking communities, which is roughly the San Luis Obispo County area. I'm an educator. I work as an adjunct professor at the Institute of American Indian Arts, and I'm also a place-based artist. And the way I'm defining place-based is my practice is rooted in place, and the materials and resources that I use, or the narratives that I use in my practice, all come from that long-standing or centuries of relationship to place. So most of my work in the last couple of years have been impacted with some of the regulatory gathering rights of shell or access to some of our resources. So it's really caused me to pivot some of my mediums, and to really make some hard decisions about what resources I use in my practice that stay with community, and how I continue to make work that can go outside of my community. So we're at a very critical time for our community, and it's very challenging, because not only do we use our cultural resources for our artistic practices and vernacular, but it also impacts our foodways. And so when we don't have access to certain foodways, then it makes it challenging for us to teach our younger generations how to gather, how to harvest, how to cook, how to take those materials and turn them into art. So that's just kind of a little bit about my practice.
Okay, so Gus, do you want to?
Hi there. I'm just am I unmuted?
Yes, I can hear you just fine.
Okay, cool. Let's see. Got a couple slides here. Hello, I'm Gus Gates. I'm the West Coast Regional Director with the Surfrider Foundation, and I'm based in Rainier Beach, Washington. I just wanted to say really quickly, thank you so much to the organizers, and thank you to Dina for the invitation to participate here today. So just real quick, I got a couple of slides. Who am I? I was born and raised on the Siuslaw River on the Central Oregon coast, and in Oregon. And if you know a thing or two about salmon, you know that the Siuslaw is historically the largest producer of coho salmon south of the Columbia River. And if you know a thing or two, you know that this is actually not a coho, it's a king. But one of the key things about the Siuslaw is that we have no dams and no hatcheries on that river. And I spent my formative years there on the Central Coast, fishing and swimming and surfing, in the lake and rivers and oceans of the area. I've been with Surfrider now for over 15 years. I got my start as an activist and a chapter leader. Started out as an Oregon staff member, and then came up to Washington as Washington staff, and then now recently over the last 2 years as the West Coast Regional Director. And when I moved up to Washington 10 years ago, one of the first things that I noticed really was the strong presence of the coastal tribes and coastal conservation issues. And, it's really palpable to me. And I was really fortunate to inherit and, learn from people who were staff before me and introduce me to many tribal leaders and tribal staff that we had worked with. And so one of the first things after I came here, we were invited by the Quinault Indian Nation, along with our partners at Warm Current, to come to Point Grenville on the Quinault Reservation to hold a tribal youth surf camp and beach cleanup with the folks there. And immediately I realized like how beautiful and special this place was. But really it was hearing the stories of Ed Johnstone, who's pictured here, who's on the tribal council and the head of fisheries, talking with the tribal youth, that I really quickly learned what a honor and a privilege it was to be a guest and to visit this special place, and to realize that non-tribal members had not been allowed to attend and visit this special place since the 1960s. So it was really an honor for me to be there. Being there and starting some of these relationships led to other work with the Quinault Indian Nation on issues like trying to stop the massive oil terminal that was being built for export or that was proposed in Grays Harbor. As well as, when the Trump administration, as you might recall, proposed opening up 90% of America's coastline to offshore oil and gas drilling. When that happened, Governor Inslee invited us and other partners to organize a press conference down in Olympia, and we agreed to do so. But we, said if we're going to do this, we want to make sure that tribal leaders can be centered in this perspective, and as their usual and accustomed tribal treaty rights were directly at threat by any proposed offshore development from this. And so pictured here, we had the Attorney General, tribal leaders, fishing community leaders, coastal leaders, Public Lands Commissioner, Governor Inslee. And our press conference made national news, which was kind of surprising, I think, at the time. And it really highlighted to me the importance of centering tribal perspectives in this important conversation that was happening. But really, a key lesson learned, I think, at that time for me was, the importance of stepping up, but also stepping back to make sure that the voices of those who would be most affected by some of these decisions came across as the loudest. At Surfrider, and here in Washington, I feel like we really have been, kind of on this journey of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion really since around 2016 or so. And our national organization has followed, in those steps as well, redoubling those efforts, like many others, in the social justice reckoning that occurred in early 2020. Since that time, our chapters and staff have really been seeking guidance and how we can show up and be better partners to tribal communities and develop stronger relationships in a more meaningful way. And so today, I have the responsibility, if you will, of co-leading our tribal engagement working group at Surfrider Foundation. And I would characterize that as in the early stages, but a really important effort that I'm really excited about and really grateful for Dina's support in that space. So with that, I will pass the baton and stop sharing my screen.
Great, thank you, Gus. Calla, it's your turn.
All right, thank you for having me. My name is Calla Allison. I'm the founder and director of the Marine Protected Area Collaborative Network, and I'm zooming in from the unceded lands of the Hatchiman in southern Orange County, but originally from Aptos in Santa Cruz, which is not pronounced Aptos. Everyone assumes that it's descended from Spanish. It's not. It's an indigenous language along with SoCal, our neighboring city. So it just goes to show there's a lot of work that needs to be done in educating people about the original and ongoing stewards of this land. I'm going to start by showing a video because I think it does a better job than I do just giving a background of the MPA Collaborative Network and some of our work. I'm hoping it works out for us, so stand by.
One of the biggest accomplishments of the collaborative network and something we really value is bringing together people that might not have come together otherwise to think about the best way to manage marine protected areas. Bringing the tribes together with agency and enforcement officers, with environmental nonprofits, bringing them together with the fishermen, and bringing the scientists too that can share their perspective. Having all those people at the table and having them feel like their voices are heard and that their voices are valued, that is a huge asset that really can't be replicated anywhere else. It needs to be channeled and harnessed and leveraged in a way that can really help fish and wildlife do the best job they can.
I think we all are very, very concerned about the ocean condition. I mean, this is our livelihood. This is what we do for a living. And We certainly do not want to see any damage done to the ocean in any way. There's a way to work around this stuff. Everybody needs a little bit, you know, we need to give and take.
One of the problems we've had historically with resource management is that people tend to work in their own little silo. The scientists work on the research and monitoring, enforcement officers just do enforcement, the nonprofits are working on the conservation side, and the fishermen are making a living. And I think it's really important connecting them to the managing agency so they're not all on their own doing separate, disparate things, but they're coming together with the managing agency, doing something that's approved, that can actually be supportive. So there's this top-down, bottom-up where we come together and make very valuable products, we make valuable relationships, and we're actually able to leverage not just the natural resources, but the social resources and the value they bring to the table as well. We want to make sure that they're not paper parks, of course. We want to manage them for the long term. And part of that effort is making sure that we really start enabling communities to become stewards of their MPAs, and hopefully that spreads beyond the coast and becomes a part of who we are, our coastal stewards.
All right. So as the video says, we're all about bringing together and elevating local voices and efforts for more effective MPA management and ocean stewardship. And our tribal and indigenous partners are one of, if not the most important voice that needs to be heard. And as Dina mentioned, you know, there were some missteps and missed opportunities during the Marine Life Protection Act designation process. And at the end of that, the collaborative network came about to make sure that all voices were heard in the ongoing management and stewardship of marine protected areas, especially focusing on those voices that might not have been heard as loudly or at all in the designation process. So we really did a lot of concerted outreach at the beginning of 2014 with our 14 collaboratives, roughly based on county lines in California. We had 16% of our membership were tribally affiliated. That percentage has gone down with our increase of our overall membership. But overall, we've been increasing steadily our Indigenous and tribal affiliated participation in the collaboratives, and the collaboratives have really benefited from that insight and partnership. And we're hoping to leverage that and use our lessons learned at the local level to help inform the state. The state is working on bringing tribes to the table, which is great. It's a start. It's definitely an important first step, but we're encouraging them to move to bringing people into the kitchen, having them think about designing the menu, coming up with the recipes and making the meals. So engaging early and often in making sure all their voices are heard in every aspect of MPA management and ocean stewardship as a whole. And I'll stop there.
All right, thank you, Calla. Now we're going to engage in you know, the roundtable portion of this. And I've got some questions for each of you. And I want to start with Leah. I want to ask you if you can talk about some of the ocean conservation projects YTT Chumash is engaged in and some of the challenges you're facing. And yeah, and anything else you might want to add to that.
Well, I'd love to be able to talk about the projects, but I think I'm going to flip the question a little bit, because I think really need to talk about the issues before we can really talk about projects, because the area we're specifically focusing on is a large part of California, pretty much from Sonoma County down the coast. There are no federally recognized tribes, and that is by design, which makes it very challenging when we're trying to identify tribes, because California does not have an official state recognition process. And so what happens is our state does a very poor job of identifying who is a historical tribe and who is just a nonprofit masquerading as a tribe. And so often what happens is a lot of conservation groups are looking for the most visual people. And usually those are the people that are performing. And so they often get selected to be a part of these collaborations. And when they have no genealogy tied to the villages on those coastal areas that we're trying to protect. And so for my particular community, we are talking about roughly the San Luis Obispo kind of area. And we are currently working on working with PG&E on the Diablo power plant for land back. But, the state has decided, it sounds like they're going to keep it open for a little longer. So that's not a possibility. But most of the historic tribal communities along the coast of California are landless. And so it makes it very challenging to protect our homelands when we don't even have access to them half the time. And so I think, and I can only speak for my community. I can't speak for anybody else's community, but currently our community is working with, or has been invited to the table with NOAA for a Chumash Marine Sanctuary. However, the lead agency of the sanctuary has no ties to those villages at all. And when we've made it very clear that the organization leading this effort has no genealogical ties to the land or to those villages, we're dismissed. And so what's the point of coming to the table if we're not going to be listened to? And so it's kind of the charades of, look, we're working with Native people, but unless those communities are thoroughly vetted, then it's not helpful. It's actually harmful, because in our instance, in our community, there is this organization that is making decisions about our homelands who have no ties, no history, no knowledge of that land or the resources there. And then it further makes us invisible, the people that are quietly doing the work. And when you are not a federally recognized tribe, you don't have support through the federal government. So all of our efforts are done as volunteers. So 90% of our tribal council works a full-time job and then volunteers 20, 30, 40 hours. Our retired folks actually do work full-time for our tribe for free. Unless we find grants, but those are inconsistent. And so being able to have long-term ongoing projects is challenging when you're working with a volunteer force, an older volunteer force, right? Because our younger people are in college, they're working full-time jobs. And so they don't have the time to volunteer maybe as much as they would like to. And so it makes it very challenging to do the projects that we'd like to do. Because we just don't have the resources, we don't have the land, we don't have the manpower. Meanwhile, other organizations that are self-identifying and haven't been vetted are getting thousands of $500,000 or up to, and even more, right, to be an Indigenous partner. And so I think it's really complex. And I think it's, and I'm not blaming, conservation organizations, because I understand that there's this genuine want to have a good relationship with local Indigenous people to do the good work, it is extremely hard to vet and to find out who's real and who isn't, because our state does a horrible job of providing that information to conservation groups. Currently, there is a list through the Native American Heritage Commission for cultural resource protecting, but that list, to get on that list, they don't vet it. It's self-identified. And so people can get on that list if they have a nonprofit and just call themselves a tribe. And
Yeah,
so that
you really point to the complexities of how colonization has led to these complexities, and how difficult it's made it to do the kinds of collaborative work that you want to do when you're competing with people you shouldn't have to be competing with.
And that's where a lot of our manpower goes, is to fighting to have the truth told. And so if you've got a volunteer force and you only can volunteer 10 hours a day, and 7 of those are trying to tell NOAA that you are working with the wrong people, we just wasted time.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's an issue that's growing in importance, and it's not going to go away. And so is for conservation organizations like Surfrider, like MPACN, and so many others, this will be an issue that will have to be contended with, and we'll have to find some kinds of protocol, some kind of guidelines to help them figure out how to work with the right people. Okay, thank you, Leah. I wanted to go to Gus and ask you, how would you characterize Surfrider's trajectory relative to tribal engagement over time, and where do you see it headed? You mentioned it a little bit in your opening statement. You said since about 2016, Surfrider's really begun to focus more seriously on sort of the diversity and equity piece. But can you talk about some of the work that you've been involved with in Washington State? And I know you mentioned some of this already, but if there's other examples you want to provide, now's a good time. And then also, what kinds of successes might be seen as models for future engagement or future action in other places?
Yeah, thank you, Dina. I feel, I touched on a couple of the ones there that we've worked on over the years, and again, I think I'd be the first to acknowledge, we've done some work that we feel good about, but there's so much more work to be done, and so many challenging issues. I look at just know that our ocean and coastal communities are facing just a range of issues, most notably the impacts of coastal climate change, from sea level rise and increasing storm severity, harmful algal blooms and marine heat waves, ocean acidification. These things are all really daunting challenges, and it really is going to take all of us. And so, some of the work that we've done with tribes in Washington State, and I feel like there's been a more intentional effort in those years that I mentioned, but again, there was a lot of work and relationships that have been established long before my time even coming to Washington. So just grateful for that, and a lot of the work I feel like that we've done in Washington, they have such strong tribal leadership. I feel like looking at the issue of sea level rise and coastal hazards, again thinking about the village of Tahola and the Quinault Indian Nation, and right there at ground zero, really there, and Queets, as far as tsunami vulnerability and sea level rise and increasing storm severity. And they're taking active steps right now, to relocate their entire village, as is the Quileute tribe, just to the north. And it's like, I mean, that is like the definition of leadership in my mind. And so, when I look at that, challenge that they're facing, they've been there since time immemorial. And, communities just down the coast in Ocean Shores and Pacific Beach who are facing the same challenges, but they're trying to hold the line, and protect the coast as they know it. We really need to be looking to our tribal partners at their leadership that they're, putting forward right now, and following in that direction, because they're onto something there. And so, through this effort in the coastal resilience space that we've been focusing our energy on a lot, there's been a lot of involvement, and a big credit really, I think, goes to the state of Washington and the Department of Ecology that's been helping to bring folks along, really, even during the pandemic space, through the Washington Coastal Marine Advisory Council. A lot of input around how we're making recommendations on this issue and working together to come up with funding from the state legislature. So I think there's a lot of models there that I think are applicable for other places. And really, at the end of the day, I'm reminded that years and years ago, elder tribal woman told me when I was doing public speaking engagement, and she said, we're all in this leaky canoe together. And the sooner that we stop throwing rocks at each other, the better off that we'll be. And those words of wisdom have really stuck with me in some of these daunting challenges that we face. So I feel like, at Surfrider, thanks again to your support, like we're making some steps in the right direction. And we know that this is going to be a marathon and not a sprint. And we have a lot of work to do over the years. So I think that there's some lessons that could be shared with other communities around the country. And I hope that we can, by doing this work, provide, some resources and training and guidance of what has worked in other places that hopefully, folks can lean into a little bit more and make some better connections in their communities.
Thanks, Gus. That's a perfect lead-in for Calla, because that's really what I want to lean into with my question to you, Calla, with MPACN structure, which is really similar to Surfriders, which is based on this network. The Surfrider model is based on what they call chapters, right? All these independent chapters around the country, really around the world. And MPACN is similar. So what I'd like to know is what you've observed in terms of the individual MPAs in California and their attitudes about tribal engagement, and what kind of obstacles or conversely opportunities have there been on the part of MPAs to work with tribes. And also I wanted to, in your opening statement, you said that the collaboratives have really benefited from this engagement. So I wanted to hear more about that too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the way we see the collaboratives, they're as strong as they are diverse. So the more diverse we are, the stronger we are, because the more perspectives that are heard, and we learn from each other, and that's the best way we learn. But as far as our tribal engagement, that was, one of the priorities in putting the collaboratives together from the beginning. So in some areas we were more successful. Del Norte, almost the entire collaborative was tribal affiliated or made up of Indigenous people because of the population of Del Norte County. And then as we moved, like Leah said, as we moved to the Central Coast, it got harder. Even though we had Haley Batista as one of our co-chairs who contributed, just some excellent input. We had, for example, a kids activity book that had a whole page on Northern Chumash and had a coloring page. And really kind of overall, we benefited from participation is just bringing voices to the front and saying, this isn't just history. We are still here and we are very diverse ourselves. And, learning about marine protected areas along the coast of California includes learning about the people that have been stewarding the coast and ocean since time immemorial. It should be all a part of what we're learning and thinking about. And just having that frame, I think, has helped all of our collaborative members think about their projects in a different way. Like, how do we outreach to the public, let them know about marine protected areas, and what does that mean? What do they need to know? Yeah, it's been an interesting ride. As I said, you know, lots of lessons learned, so many missteps. And this is something that we share with our collaborative chairs and our members, is just, you know, don't be afraid of those missteps, learn from them. You know, if you cause harm, acknowledge, apologize, and move on, but continue to work. And I think, you know, the issue of who to engage with and who not, that is very difficult for our collaborative members, because none of us are qualified to make that determination, of course. And so we just encourage everyone to come and just speak on behalf of themselves, you know, and just, you know, come and talk about their experiences and their perspectives. And then we can still, you know, learn from everybody. I think somebody brought up in the Q&A about lessons learned, we did put together a best practices for tribal engagement, and of course it's not the end all be all, we're all constantly learning and adjusting these lessons, but it's kind of things we have picked up along the way. And, you know, there's a lot. I could get into the details, but I want to give other people a chance to talk on the panel. I'll put it in the chat though right now for everybody.
Leah, I wonder if you have any thoughts about, you know, so, you know, I'm hearing reflected just in what Calla said about this issue of, you know, how to identify who to work with. And so it's on both sides. It's on the tribal side, it's on the conservation side. Do you have any thoughts or advice, suggestions about how conservationists wanting to work with tribes can, you know, make their way through that quagmire? How can they identify the right people to work with?
Again, that's super challenging for outsiders. I think the one thing that we all can do collectively to take action is really put pressure on our state to do better, right? The state really needs to do better. I think there's some fear about identifying and having an official process to acknowledge the tribes on the coast, because when you think about the most expensive properties and areas in California, it is, again, by design, all that area where there are no federally recognized tribes. And so I think that there is some fear when we talk about land back. What does that look like? But I think that something that everybody can do is really put pressure on the state to do better, and to identify those communities and to do the work to properly vet those communities and to provide that resource to conservation groups. In the meantime, because I don't think that's going to happen, I know that we are in the process, my community's been involved with the Native American Heritage kind of redrafting some of their protocols, but I don't feel like they go far enough, even in the draft regulations. But I think for now, it's got to be through community, right? So for instance, you were very instrumental, Dina, in helping our community be found, right? So it's through community networks, through universities. It's very tricky, and I don't have the answer right now. I wish I did. I wish it was easy. But, you know, unfortunately, both the federal government and the state of California has really let down those tribes, especially those that are, you know, never had their, well, in the 18 unratified treaties, which is like a whole nother story. But, you know, both the federal government and the states have really let the unrecognized tribes of California, the historic unrecognized tribes of California down. And it has caused a lot of harm, and it continues to cause harm because we are invisible, and oftentimes, again, we aren't on the radar of conservation groups, and so we're left out of those conversations. And so other people are making decisions about our homeland, people who don't have those, as Gus was saying, those long, you know, standing relationships. So it can cause more harm. And again, I wish I had the answer. I wish it was easy.
Well, you know, this is an opportunity for me to do a shameless plug. On our campus at Cal State University San Marcos, where I teach in the American Indian Studies Department, we have the California Indian Culture and Sovereignty Center, and we recently formed an initiative called the Indigenous Climate and Environmental Collaborative. And it's something like we might call a review board. We saw the need because of all this new demand to work with tribes and all this new funding. We saw there's all kinds of initiatives popping up on university campuses that in American Indian Studies programs that have formed to work on climate change initiatives and environmental other kinds of environmental projects with tribes. But most of the time, those organizations are formed as sort of like technical assistance, to science and researchers. We did not, when we did the research to see what's out there, we did not see, we saw very little, if any, that are intervening in sort of policy issues. And so we stepped in to fill that need. So I think an organization like this, like us, a university-based, research-based kind of organization, can help fill a need like that. Not that we're the arbiters of identity, but that we are connected to, tribal government associations, federally recognized tribes, and non-federally recognized tribes as well. That we are, somewhat equipped to be able to advise people on those kinds of issues. So just a shameless plug, anybody in the audience, working on research projects, community-based projects, look us up. We are on the web in the Indigenous Climate and Environmental Collaborative, and that could be, a way to start. So I think we're at the point of the program where we can take some questions, Steve.
Yes, I was just going to pipe up and say we've got some amazing questions in the Q&A. And first of all, thank you all for this brilliant roundtable. There's so much to unpack. So one of the key issues that I'm seeing in the Q&A, and which Leah introduced, is the challenge for doing this kind of work when tribes aren't federally recognized, which turns out to be most of California's tribes, right? So Leanna asked this question: how can we help as non-tribal members get funding and resources for communities and their efforts that are not federally recognized? So this is a real pragmatic question, right? So what mechanisms exist for tribes that aren't federally recognized to assert their sovereignty, their traditional land management practices, their values and knowledges onto the lands and waters that are theirs? So if anyone has insights into how that works in California and whether that generates anything for you, we can move on as well.
Again, it's really challenging, and I mean, and it's not just on the coast, it's in Gold Country. It's all over California. There are so many historical, legitimate tribes that are unrecognized. And, it costs tribes millions and millions and millions to even petition for federal acknowledgement. So it's not an easy fix as, oh, just apply for federal recognition. And you have to remember that the way in which the federal government recognizes tribes is based on political and social organizations that weren't a part of California's first Indigenous peoples governance, right? So the way that California were small bands that were linguistically connected. So it's not like these big, huge tribes. So when you say the word, for example, Chumash, there are 7 different Chumash languages. And within those Chumash languages, there are dialects. So it's not just like one big nation, and each one of those villages had its own autonomy, and maybe they were kind of loosely confederated based on language and geographical location. But pre-contact, California was one of the most linguistically diverse places in the world. And to minimize it into just, 100 tribes or 107 tribes is really misleading. And, again, I wish there was an easy fix. And if anybody has ideas, contact our state representatives, ask them to take action. We need help.
I can chime in just kind of how non-Indigenous can help support. I mean, there are a lot of, Indigenous-led efforts too. It's not just about integrating perspectives, but also in supporting the efforts that are Indigenous-led. We have the Tribal Marine Stewards Network. We have a Tribal Marine Collaborative that's trying to bring a lot of different tribal voices together, including non-federally recognized with the federally recognized, and having a space for those discussions to happen just between Indigenous people and within those tribes. And so that's always a great way to support. And that's part of like what Gus said about stepping up and stepping back, which is great, is how to provide platforms and voices, but to know when to step back and let those voices lead and kind of speak for themselves. And not picking and choosing who speaks, because we don't want to be in that position. It's not helpful, and there's so much great work that is being tribally led out there. So that would be one of my suggestions, but just as efforts, that's part of our best practices too, is really kind of digging in and learning about, the land you live on, where you're from, the history of those tribes, what they're doing now, visiting with, reaching out, building relationships, with the local tribal office maybe. And I think making that effort is just a great first step to just increasing your awareness and knowledge. I mean, we should all be embracing being lifelong learners. But yeah, that's I think a positive first step for everyone.
Steve, have you got another question lined up for us?
I do. Another key issue that people are raising is really about asymmetrical power relations, right? So like when we talk about collaboration between Native and non-Native organizations, entities, groups within a situation that's been informed by centuries of colonialism, right? You have like massive differences in the kinds of political power that people bring to a collaboration, right? And the concern that several people have raised is like, Judith raises this: who are they who are deciding which organizations get grants? So that's a question about funding. But there's other ways of sort of thinking about it. Another anonymous attendee asks, could someone speak to the efforts made to ensure that knowledge holders and tribal governments are included in decision-making, in addition to Indigenous knowledge as an isolated output? So this suggests that a real concern that people are having is the question of the difference, in a sense, between increasing tribal participation, possibly, or collaboration, or say like integration or something like that, and what it might mean to indigenize at the level of integrating Indigenous rights to self-determination at the center of conservation work. So if people have thoughts on how to parse those differences, it might enliven the conversation for these particular questioners. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, it's fairly clear when we're talking about federally recognized tribes, like that's a framework that's pretty well established, that tribes with treaty, even if they don't have treaties, they are still, subject to federal Indian law and the frameworks of the trust relationship. So all of that governs what happens with with tribes and sovereignty. So sovereignty is pretty clear what sovereignty is with a federally recognized tribe. But it's an entirely different thing when we're talking about non-federally recognized tribes. That's when it gets really murky and really problematic. So, you know, I think it's really important for us to have these conversations right now. I mean, even though it probably seems like we're focusing so much on identity and identity politics, even like if it's got to work, if we talk about the most challenging aspects of all of this, we have to be able to include the most vulnerable of people. We have to be able to address it in ways so that they don't get left behind. So I don't know, Leah, any thoughts?
Well, I mean, even some of these funders, I mean, are they vetting? Are they giving money to the right groups? Because the wrong groups are often getting funded, and so it makes it really challenging. Again, and I know that we keep talking about it, but I think that this is such a huge part of the issue that if this could get fixed, it would be easy to move forward and do the good work that we all want to do, right? But because of this kind of stumbling issue, it sometimes causes more harm, and then the good work doesn't actually get done. It may look like it's getting done because it makes good headlines. This organization partnered with a tribe, but if it's not a real tribe from that community, then the work is actually going to harm the real community. And so, if we could just kind of figure this part out, I think everything else would fall into place, and then we can go full steam ahead on doing the work that really, really needs to be done instead of focusing on this.
Right, like what's happening in Washington. Like Gus, you spoke really clearly to the issues of Quinault and the Quileutes and Queets, where those are federally recognized tribes. They have pipeline to dollars, to money, to address the issues like moving an entire village of Tahola. So, I would say, or I guess I could ask, in Washington, you probably don't deal with the same kinds of issues, right? I mean, are there other kinds of issues what you would identify?
Well, it may be a little bit different, but I mean, right here where I am, on the ancestral lands of the Duwamish tribe, they're not federally recognized right now, currently. You go down to the mouth of the Columbia, the Chinook are not federally recognized and are struggling to get land right now. So I don't see the same, at least personally, and I'd love to hear otherwise, maybe in the chat, because I see a lot of friends, in there from Washington State. But if there are others that are, having these identity issues and kind of, I'm not aware of that happening here.
Okay, well, thank you for that. I think we are coming to a close or to thinking about moving in that direction. And we like to think about calls to action when we do these programs, through the Natural History Museum. And if I was to issue a call to action, I would say that for me, it's always centered on education. So I would say to learn everything that you can about institutions and tribes, about how they are working together and how and support the work of organizations like Surfrider and the Marine Protected Area Collaborative Network, who are investing, really going out of their way to invest resources and energy in this work. Take time to learn about what tribal groups like YTT Chumash are doing. How can you support them? How might you get involved? YTT Chumash has a beautiful website that's it's very in depth, showing their history, showing the kinds of things that they're involved in, and so that's a good place to start if you're California based, for example. Be aware and discriminating about the Indigenous groups that you choose to get involved with, and don't be afraid to ask questions. When you are doing that kind of vetting. So really, the point is to do the vetting, and not be afraid to do that. So any final calls to action from Kala, Gus, or Leah?
I would just say, you know, sometimes I think people are afraid of, as I said earlier, misstepping or doing something wrong. You know, we don't want to do anything wrong. We don't want to hurt people. We don't want to feel uncomfortable. But you know, this social justice, environmental justice is very important work. And I don't think we should shy away from it. It is very, very complicated, as you heard. And I know some of you are thinking, oh, how would I vet? So like, how does this work? And yeah, it is complicated. And I think we just have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable, but not shy away from the work either. It's going to be a part of every environmental action. Every call to action about the environment is going to include a social justice piece and aspect, and needs to really integrate the Indigenous perspective, and center that. So that, I guess, would be my word of advice, is just double down, don't be afraid, and kind of keep committed to the work, and stay positive.
Well, that is a great note for us to close this discussion out on. Thank you, Kala, and thank you so much, Dina, for convening everybody. Dina is one of our Red Natural History Fellows, and Leah and Gus and Kala really appreciate everything that you shared today. I want to encourage everybody, don't miss the next event in the World in Natural History for a World in Crisis series. It's on July 18th. It's called Resisting the Global Land Grab. It's organized by Ashley Dawson, also a fellow with the Natural History Museum and environmental historian and writer. Panelists will be Crystal Tubols, Lakota Cheyenne, and now the executive director of Honor the Earth, as well as Nemo Bassi, Nigerian poet and activist. And thank you again to our sponsors for helping to make this possible. We appreciate you, Luce Foundation, Hewlett Foundation, and For Culture. And I want to give a shout out also to our event team at the Natural History Museum and our tech team over at Alluvium Gatherings, Cal Moody. We would love your feedback, so please do check your email for a survey or the poll that popped up. You could fill that out. We will be sending out a recording from today, and as well as the chat transcript with any resources that were shared. If you enjoyed this, you can learn more about the Natural History Museum and also sign up for our email list over at thenaturalhistorymuseum.org. So with that, have a great Friday night. We're going to close you out with Son of the Sun by the Micmac songwriter and activist Willie Dunn. Have a great night.
Son of the sun, son of the earth, the soul of life, children of the world, daughters of starlight, and daughters of mirth, sisters of sunlight, sisters of earth, brothers of nature, brothers of old, brothers of legend, and the story untold. I had a dream a mile ago. They laid to rest a gun and a sword, buried the hatchet, buried the snake, vowed to each other peace to make. The earth supplies and nature feeds, but we turn and quake for artificial needs. Come down to earth to stay a while. The sun is shining, just sit there and smile. I'm a brown-skinned man, that's what I am. Got a guitar and a drum, that's where I come from. Spirit of the sun, spirit of the sea, worthy of the shadow, come shine down on me. Son of the sun, son of the earth, soul of light, children of the word, brothers of nature, brothers of old, brothers of the legends and the story untold, daughters of starlight, daughters of earth, sisters of sunlight, sisters of earth. Mild and cold, they lay to rest with gun and the sword. They bury the hatchet, they bury the snake, bow to each other, peace to make. Oh, son of the sun,